At Arizona State University, we've made online education better, smarter, and more personalized so you can go further in your aspiring field.
I decided to pursue medicine once I realized that ASU did have the online program for biological sciences. You're still required to learn the same curriculum. You're still being tested on the same content that anyone would be tested on in person. The comprehensiveness of the program prepared me so well for medical school.
Explore over 350 plus programs at asuonline.asu.edu.
Well, howdy, folks. Welcome to part 2 of my archaeology journey in Italy. In this episode, we're going to go through a typical workday. A lot of the workdays were typical until we found the graveyard. Then we'll talk about what I got up to after work. And along those lines, we're going to meet the person I hung out with the most. Turns out he was not an archaeologist. He couldn't care less about all this boring history. And speaking of boring history, we're going to talk about sealing disobedient women in caves. In other words, the horrible, grim, miserable world of Sophocles. We're going to hear scenes from one of his plays, and some of these will be my own translations from the original Greek. But now it's time to wake up, get your cold shower, get your equipment on. We got to be in the van by 7 a.m. We got lots of ground to cover today. We start the day with lots of espresso. We survive the day with lots of water and sunscreen. Lots of sunscreen. Then we're going to end the day with lots of wine. And sometimes gin. But the only thing that really matters here is that I'm going to get to wear a fedora to work every day. It's finally socially acceptable. And what does ancient Greek tragedy have to do with this ambitious, scrawny American I was in 1999? Was my life going to be a tragedy? Well, the beautiful thing about tragedy is whether my life would become a tragedy was entirely up to me. Anytime you open the script for a play, you'll see a page labeled Dramatis Personae, and those are the people of the drama, the people who our hero interacts with. My 3 primary companions were Steve, Albert, and Daniel. I was a roommate with Albert and Daniel. We slept on 3 little twin beds in one big apartment bedroom. Steve's room was in the same apartment, but he had his own little bedroom. Steve was a tall Virginian guy. He was trained primarily in Neolithic artifacts. He wasn't a classicist, but he had a lot of training in ground surveys, making maps, and identifying obscure artifacts. In other words, I believe Dr. Carter picked Steve because he would be the most likely to find all of the houses and threshing floors or barge landings, that sort of thing. Steve and I got along okay. I think he found me to be a little overly energetic, a little too talkative, and maybe having one too many suggestions. Later on, when we discovered the graveyard and we were concerned about some security issues, I pushed hard with Dr. Carter to let me solve the security issues myself, which he thought was insane. But in general, I think he thought I had a good eye and didn't complain much in general about hardship. But I certainly had a constant stream of ideas about the mechanics of what we were doing. Steve had been digging around the Mediterranean for a decade, had a PhD in archaeology. He was the guy who ran out of toilet paper on a dig in Israel. Since Steve was the field director and he had his own bedroom and he had been working there for a lot longer than the rest of us, he kind of kept to himself. I didn't associate with Steve that much all the time, except sometimes at dinner. We called Steve the capo. We weren't supposed to use mafia terminology, but in the apartment or in the van, out in the field when we're by ourselves, we would sometimes break out that vocabulary. Steve was the capo. Dr. Carter, being the head guy in charge, he was the capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. Now, the 2 guys that I roomed with were Albert and Daniel. Albert we called the vice capo, the second in command. He was also a tall guy, kind of a deep, booming voice. His Italian was perfect. He was actually part Italian. His family was from New Orleans. He was a very meticulous, curious guy. He knew his languages, he knew his dates, he knew his artifacts. He had family from New Orleans. I know he studied at Tulane and at Harvard. We all really respected Albert because he's a very nice, understanding guy. He had this big booming voice, but he didn't talk much. He had a very dry, subtle sense of humor. Next was Daniel. Daniel didn't have a PhD, but Daniel already had a bachelor's in classics, and he was a grad student. The Mediterranean sun was especially brutal to him. He ran out of his supply of sunscreen rather quickly. We let him borrow some of ours, but ultimately we had to make a special 30-mile trip to search for some suitable sunscreen for him because the southern Italians, especially the older people, didn't know what we were talking about when we tried to explain sunscreen to them. That was a little frustrating. But Daniel didn't like me at all. He thought I was loud, crude, opinionated. We had words on a few occasions. Snarky schoolyard stuff, questioning each other's judgment or strength or capabilities. All was forgiven by the end of the day, usually because it was 110 degrees out there every day. And we're out there under the sun arguing about angles and maps and total counts of artifacts and logging red flags that we put in the field, walking for 5 hours straight with nothing but some biscotti and espresso. And you're doing this 6 days a week, all day with the same guys. And we're all intellectual, know-it-all assholes, so of course we're going to get cranky. Add to that another element I noticed. People in the classics and people who are in archaeology tend to come from money. And it makes sense because it's not a lucrative career, but it has a lot of cultural cachet. I can see a young kid who's sitting on a lot of generational wealth choosing that to carve out a meaningful life in this weird capitalist system we live in. Daniel also made fun of my original instinct to find a walking stick and hold on to it. I learned as a kid, anytime I was walking through an unfamiliar field with high grass, especially if it's wet or it's been disturbed recently, you bring a stick because you poke ahead to avoid stepping on a snake. And the longer the stick, the better, because in southeast Texas, the snake we're talking about might be 10 feet long if it's a water moccasin. In Italy, we were only concerned with these little black viperi, which, coming from Texas, you're not exactly scared of. There were no rattlesnakes out there, so I was calm and collected. I didn't care. The worst thing we ran into were the vespe, the wasps. So it turned out the stick wasn't absolutely necessary for safety purposes, but it was great for tipping over clods of plowed dirt to see what was poking out underneath. Also, one thing I found out was that spiders love orange groves for some reason. They put their webs all up between the trees, they're on the ground. So whenever we were in orange groves, I had to use the stick to knock down the spider's webs in front of me so I wouldn't walk face first into some giant gross spider. Also, walking sticks just help when you're just plain old tired and your legs need a little bit of help from your arms. When we took all the pauses out, we were walking for about 5 hours a day continuously, nonstop. And not on roads either. We're walking through forests and fields, usually fields that had been plowed a couple of days before. So we were all intellectuals. We weren't breaking world records for endurance. And there were a lot of pauses for us to compare notes and look at maps and write stuff down. But Daniel was a good guy. I would say that on the jerk scale, I was probably a little higher, and so I don't have any negative feelings at all toward the guy. I didn't keep up with anybody after this trip, but I hope he found a program that he liked and got published and made his name. That's what I'm hoping. Okay, moving on. Another mention of Dr. Carter. He stayed in a separate apartment. We didn't see him much during the trip. Saw him every weekend. He would show up for certain dinners, especially if any local dignitaries came by, like someone from the office of the director of antiquities, or if any of the people that I called the money people came by. There was one guy who was an oil billionaire, and he was funding the trip. And I thought it was a little unfair that there were all these rules about us not holding on to any artifacts, but I was told that the money guy could take home anything he saw that he liked. Also, it was part of my job to follow him around to make sure that he didn't trip and fall when he wanted to see some of the sights. Now, last but not least, is Genya. Genya was a Ukrainian who was about my exact same age. He was also an undergrad. I was the only undergraduate on the archaeology team. Genya not being an undergrad doesn't really count because he was not on the archaeology team at all. They roped him in to help us later on when we found the graveyard, and we a lot of hands on deck, but Genya was a translator. He worked directly for Dr. Carter. Genya was in Italy with us, but did not speak a word of Italian. What he did all day was either in Dr. Carter's apartment or in ours. He would stay there all day translating papers from English to German or vice versa, and then translated Russian and Ukrainian archaeological documents into English for Dr. Carter. So while I was out walking all day in the sun, he was typing all day in the shade. He was worried about grammar and word choice, while I was trying to perfect an exactly 1 meter wide stride so that I could pace off sites and make maps without needing that darn little measuring disc or any other fancy GPS type equipment. And Genya wasn't just Ukrainian, he was Ukrainian, as in with italics, meaning there was no doubt about Genya's ethnicity. He was about 6'1", blonde hair, blue eyes. He was a physically attractive guy. He had a boyish awkwardness that some ladies didn't find endearing. To give you an example of that, when Genya and I went to Naples for the weekend, I made sure to get a proper soccer hooligan haircut, a soccer-style shirt. It's one of those horizontal striped polos, some linen pants, nice leather shoes. All of this to not stick out like a sore thumb in Naples. We weren't going to look Italian, but we could at least not look like easy target tourists. Genya shows up at the train station with a tight white t-shirt that says Taekwondo on the front. Cargo shorts, athletic socks pulled up over his calves, athletic shoes, giant backpack, and in his hand he had a large map which announced to the world that we were tourists. And to top it all off, he had a bush hat that he bought. It's that Australian hunter type hat where one side is pinned up so that you look like a big game hunter. So he spoiled my camouflage. But Genya was great. He was so much fun compared to some of the other sticks in the mud that I had to work with. He didn't want to hear about any of these old bits of junk that we found. When I got back from the field, he wanted to go out drinking. He was always on the lookout for the ladies, and he loved loud, bad European techno music. We got along extremely well. We figured out the only bar in town was this tiny place at the train station. They have about 6 tables and chairs and a little bar, and they played a little bit of music there. Genya and I would walk over there, and I'd be dusty and filthy, and we'd talk to the bartender. We'll talk more about the bartender later, and more about some of the parties that Genya was always looking for. Well, there are 3 other characters that we'll contend with in this episode. Of these 3, 1 is real and 2 are fictional. They're all ancient Greeks who lived during the classical period. They're going to be our cultural touchstone for today's episode. The 2 fictional characters are Antigone, the daughter of Oedipus. Yes, that Oedipus. The second fictional character is Creon, who was the brother of Jocasta, Oedipus's mother/wife. Now let's start with the one real person, the guy who wrote these characters, Sophocles. Sophocles, his name means renowned for his wisdom. He was born in 496 BC, so right around 500 BC, and he lived and worked until he was 90 years old. He died in 406 BC. And during this time, Sophocles is in the theater, he's singing, he's performing, he's writing. But as he got older, he also participated in the Peloponnesian War that we talked about in the first episode of this series. Sophocles served as a strategos, which was a member of a body that made military decisions for the democracy. He was born wealthy. He was noted for being very handsome and having a great singing voice. He won his first competition at 28, and that's when he became more famous. He died only 2 years before Athens fell. So he saw the whole Golden Age. He saw the end of the Golden Age when the plague hit Athens. But he never saw what happened after the Golden Age. One thing I found was that translations of Sophocles were almost always lacking in either the musicality or the poetry or the emotional extremes. I also saw that many modern translations are polluted with modern ideas that have no place in a proper ancient Greek tragedy. And what are these modern ideas? What am I talking about? Well, insanity, like the importance of the individual, or the twisted idea that a person's life is about their personal fulfillment, or the impious idea that humans could ever master and understand nature. To the ancient Greeks, we were selfish, short-sighted animals that could only glimpse now and then what the world was really like. Now, at the time in 1999, I certainly thought I was extremely important as an individual. I was seeking personal fulfillment in my life. I was wearing a fedora, for God's sake. I mean, I was very fulfilled. Writers like Sophocles are closer to my heart now because 25 years later, I'm doubting some of these things. I have found that the most valuable things in my life have nothing to do with my importance as an individual, have nothing to do with my personal fulfillment, but the fulfillment of other people. Early on, this pre-modern, less individualistic, grim outlook, I think tapped me on the shoulder and started to make me think about my quarter-life crisis. When I got back to the U.S., what was I going to do? Was I going to leave my fiance again to go to Israel and dig with Steve with no toilet paper? Or was I going to come back to Austin, finish my degree, and start a family? These were the kinds of questions I started to think about. Well, what is a tragedy anyway? In our modern era now, people are using the word tragedy incorrectly. According to the original technical meaning of the term, a random event is not tragic. For example, the Asian tsunami came out of the blue, killed thousands of people. Not a tragedy. Doesn't qualify. And this is because a tragedy was a kind of morality play that was designed to warn people against the excesses of human pride or ambition. Hubris was the term. It was the problem that tragedy was examining in the human condition. A tragedy only occurred when a human destroyed themselves through hubris. There has to be a central flaw to the character, and the character has to have the capacity for greatness, or has to be a great character, and then they fall not through some random circumstance, but because of a decision they made, because of their hard-headedness, their impiety, their lack of understanding of their proper place in the universe. That's what a tragedy is. So we could think of a story like The Sopranos or Breaking Bad. Those are definitely tragedies because those are characters who are clearly shown to be bright, energetic, charismatic, intelligent, capable, and then through their own pride, problems that come strictly out of their own little brains, they end up destroying everything they love around them and themselves ultimately. That's what tragedy means. For ancient people, some terrible thing coming out of the blue and destroying an entire family of truly great people for no particular reason, that was just called Monday. I mean, that was just called a typical day. So we have to put ourselves in ancient people's places and understand how terrifying the world was for them because no one was even in charge of their universe. For a lot of people now, we think of a central force that guides the universe in some way, whether thoughtfully or not. We forget sometimes that ancient people saw the universe as a chaotic battle of wills. You had dozens of gods, all with their own principles and ambitions. And that's part of how they explain the unfairness and the chaos of the universe. In fact, when Christianity took over, a whole new branch of philosophy came about, theodicy. Theodicy is the justification of God. It's a Greek word which means justifying God, Because if there's only one being that designed the universe from scratch and controls it with no input from anyone else, then we have to explain why bad things happen to good people. Now, the Bible does address this. My only point is that intuitively it's easier to understand the conflict and unfairness in the universe if you see it as being operated by no one in particular, and that there are all these invisible, powerful beings that have their grudges and preferences that they enforce on the world. Where does the word come from in the first place? Well, tragos in Greek means goat, and oide means song, as in ancient choral singing. It's where our word ode in English comes from. So tragoide would be a goat ode, a goat song. And tragoidia would mean a goat songing, as in, let's go see a goat songing. Sounds fun, but it wasn't quite as fun, especially not the original ceremony that I am proposing. This is a little conspiracy of my own invention. Scholars debate about exactly what goats have to do with the origin of this kind of theater. One idea is that back in the Dark Age, before anything was written down, goats were given as prizes to the winners of theatrical competitions. In other words, goats were the Oscars of the 8th century BC. I don't buy this. Number one, I do think that the goat songing term is likely to be a slang that people used for this kind of theater because tragedies had these comic interludes, believe it or not, between scenes to allow for bathroom breaks and set changes. And set changes was a new innovation, apparently, that Sophocles started. So you had to have time to change the set. People called these interludes satyr plays because they involved characters dressed like satyrs, which means they would have horns and erect penises, comically so, and they would be fake, so they could make them as comically huge as they'd like to. And these satyrs often cruelly mocked the people who were suffering in the actual play. So when you put all this together, my thought is that going back thousands of years, I think tragedy grew out of a passion play type ceremony that developed around the sacrificing of a scapegoat, meaning a community would perform a ritual to place all their sin, to the extent they had that concept. We'll talk later about the Semitic linguistic traditions about the idea of sin versus the Greco-Roman one. But for the time being, just note that I am proposing that tragedies are supposed to be a reflection on human frailty and corruptibility precisely because it was a religious ceremony where people recognized their guilt and tried to eliminate it from the community. And I think if the goat was designed to take the pollution of impiety or hubris from the community, then it makes sense to have some sort of exhibition of how even the greatest of humans can fail, destroy themselves through that quality. And then after the play, you perform the sacrifice and you've created a very powerful psychological mechanism, I think, for the community. So my thought is that they did not give that goat away as an Oscar. That goat was slaughtered at the end of the ceremony. Luckily, by Sophocles' time, they had stopped this stuff and the goat imagery stuck in the terminology involved, but no actual goats were harmed in the making of Antigone. Well, what did we do all day? The first month was pretty repetitive. Every day was about identical until we found the graveyard, which we'll talk about in episode 4. Like all cool, sexy jobs, it started before dawn with a 6 a.m. alarm clock. Of course, Albert was the type to always be on time, and there were these big windows of our apartment room that faced out east, and all Albert had to do was open those blinds. And as soon as that Mediterranean sun comes over the horizon, we were all blinded and had to wake up. I can't stress how brutal the sun was. And coming from Southeast Texas and being used to extreme heat, there was something different about the quality of the sun. I'm not sure it had to do with the dry air either, because I have spent a lot of time in New Mexico and Arizona. And so for some reason, the Italian sun was harsher. I needed more sunscreen. I felt like I burned more easily. Not sure why that would be. Once I was awake, it's time for a quick cold shower. None of us would bother lighting the natural gas water heater unless it was on the weekend or we were getting ready to go to a dinner or some other event. Every day, one of the people who wasn't on the survey team had the duty of getting up in the morning and going to the bakery and buying bread for everybody. So we'd have it for dinner and then breakfast the next morning. And so what that meant was our breakfast consisted of 4 things. We had the espresso that Steve made. He would also bring a thermos full of it in his backpack that we could get sips from every now and then as the day went on. We also had day-old rustic Italian bread. It gets hard as a rock within 36 hours, and by 48 hours it's molding. So tough, chewy bread with Italian honey on it, miele. And miele is kind of a bright yellow color. It's not a deep golden color because the Italians mix a lot more of the beeswax into it. So it's thicker and brighter, and it has wax mixed in with it. So it's a lot more filling, you could say, than regular honey. We glanced at the map and talked about where we were going, and then we all piled into the Peugeot van by 7 a.m. to get out into the field. What we were doing was survey work. So there were designated areas on the map where they thought that there might be some sort of site, and our job was to survey it, walking 10 meters apart in a grid that covered every section to check for artifacts, basically. We would make a map of where we found the artifacts, then those maps would be reviewed to look at opportunities for excavation to learn more. Like I said earlier, excavation is the expensive part, so we want to be sure before we do that. We were doing the survey part, which is a lot cheaper because then you just hire some tedious intellectuals to slather on some sunscreen and take some counters and look for bits of pottery. So let's talk about the equipment that I brought. I made a couple of trips to the Army surplus stores here in Austin. I got myself some very dorky, very high athletic socks. They looked terrible, but they were absolutely necessary due to all the thorns and nettles that you find out there. And over those socks, I put some Israeli combat boots. These were my prized possessions. They're canvas-based instead of leather-based, and I figured I would need lots of breathable material due to the heat. I wasn't worried too much about mud or walking through water. These boots were also great because they had a type of canvas strap that wrapped around your ankle and then could be buckled as tightly as you want. And so that gave you a lot of ankle support, which was very helpful for me walking through clods of plowed earth and over rocky slopes and forests. Of course, when I bought these canvas boots, I was thinking, well, I'm not going to be walking through a lot of floodwaters, but of course, there were a couple of outrageous flash flood storms that just cropped up out of nowhere, and my boots were pretty useless for a few days. Got to have some cargo shorts, of course, and as many pockets as possible. Everything's got to be cotton, very thin, easy to wash and dry. So I brought a few of those khaki cotton work shirts, the kind with the straps that button to hold up your rolled up sleeves. We had no washing machine, no dryer. What you did with all your clothes, you wrung them out, then hung them out on the balcony. And in this Mediterranean summer, your clothes are dry in like 20 minutes. I mean, you put them out on the line before you leave in the morning. When you come back, you can fold them up because they're done. Also needed to bring a couple of bandanas, my watch, the walking stick that I talked about earlier. Sunglasses were absolutely necessary. It was an achievement just not to be blinded by the sun around noon, but to actually be able to look at the dirt and find pieces of pottery poking out of the soil. You really needed some good glasses to cut down on the glare and to be able to see through all that stuff. You absolutely needed a hat or your ears were going to get fried. I brought a straw fedora. It's the exact shape of a fedora, but it was very breathable, very open. I thought it was a good compromise because a hat was absolutely necessary. I was already branded the cowboy guy, so there was no way I was going to bring an actual cowboy hat and invite even more scrutiny and looks. Now, Steve had a thick cotton boat-style hat. No one had the poor common sense to try to get away with a felt hat out there. But even Steve's cotton hat got kind of gross because it absorbed sweat all day, and there started to be this white crust that formed at the base of the brim of his hat, and the Italians start calling it Steve's cappello di sale, meaning his salt hat. So there was that. I didn't have a salt hat. I had a cool straw fedora that worked pretty well, especially with a bandana around my neck. I was able to endure the sunlight. Now, what equipment did I carry with me? It's important to note here that I did not bring a backpack. Of course, I wasn't going to wear a backpack. That was for non-Indiana Jones types. I brought a leather over-the-shoulder bag. Who would have guessed? Just like you-know-who. And inside of that, I kept a notepad and a pen, a canteen, a compass, my counters, basically little mechanical clickers. Every time you clicked them, the numbers on them would move up one. It was all nice and analog and mechanical, nothing electronic. Towels, gloves. I always had a bag of cookies on hand. We called them cookies, but they were Italian cookies, meaning they weren't very sweet. They were like a cross between a little biscotti or shortbread cookies. They were good for making you not feel hungry. I would always boil a bunch of eggs and bring some hard-boiled eggs and salt for lunch. I kept these suction cups in my bag also. They were supposed to help for snake bites. Never came across a snake, but I did get bitten by one of these little Italian wasps, and I used the suction cup to pull the venom out, apparently, and it worked, so. Then, this is Italy, of course, so I brought toilet paper with me. And then, of course, the most important thing to bring along, water. I would fill up my canteen, then bring 2 more liters of water. I would freeze an entire liter-sized water bottle of water, bring it with me. Then, halfway between the van and the fields we were going to survey, I would stop and bury the water bottle so that on our way back, we'd have it there and it would be just the right temperature. So managing water was an issue. Also, this may have changed, but in 1999, it was kind of hard to find bottled plain water in Italy. Anytime you went into a shop or a bodega, they'd have plenty of bottles of water, but they would all be different kinds of mineral water or frizzante. They would all be sparkling water. You'd have to ask and look to find big plain bottles of acqua liscia, smooth water, which was considered weird. I think the idea was, if you want just plain water, drink it out of the tap. But of course, we needed those bottles to wander out in the wilderness all day. Your average Italian wasn't doing that. So every day, we would work a particular area of the map. It was all based on satellite photos compared with ancient maps. We would find a field, and we would focus on areas where we thought we'd find a lot of things, which would be fields that were plowed up recently. We would establish a grid pattern, 10 meters between each person to walk over that field. If we found a roof tile, we would yell, "Tile!" And then we would use our thumb to click on our tile clicker to advance one. If we found a broken piece of a lamp or culex or a vase of some kind, we would yell "sherd," because shard is not technically correct, and we would click on our sherd clicker. Once we were done walking the pattern, we would compare notes and we'd talk about how many tiles we found and where. We also kept a bundle of red flags, little metal posts with plastic red flags, and we'd put those in the ground anytime we saw something especially interesting, like a chunk of limestone, which would indicate a very serious structure, or a bit of pottery that had any painting on it, which could really help date the piece. So avoiding heat stroke was the main order of the day. We would always have a mid-morning cookie and water break around 10 o'clock. And then around noon or 1, we'd stop for our main lunch break, which would be eggs and salt. Somebody would have some Roma tomatoes usually. And we'd finish out the cookies and the water. And after our mid-afternoon break, we'd finish up whatever we were doing and head back to the van. And what did we get up to after work? Well, we'll talk about the bar at the train station and our dinner routine later on. Okay, so the tragic play that we're going to look at is called Antigone, written by our friend Sophocles. And as we mentioned earlier, Antigone is the daughter of Oedipus, a man whose name may ring a bell. So Antigone does come from a family that is far more troubled than even the families we see on White Lotus, for example. Antigone's mother was also her grandmother. Her brother, Polyneikes, was killed attempting to overthrow the new Theban king, Creon. And I think some people pronounce it Creon just to avoid conflation with the children's art implement. So Creon is Antigone's uncle, but he also has to take a hard line. And after Polyneikes was killed, King Creon issues an edict forbidding the burial of any of the people who participated, so that the corpse of Antigone's brother Polyneikes has to remain out in the fields to be torn apart by vultures and wild dogs as a kind of punishment. Well, Antigone defies this edict and buries her brother illegally. In punishment, she's sealed up in a cave. By the time King Creon is finally persuaded to show some mercy and have the cave reopened, he finds that Antigone had committed suicide by then. King Creon's son, Haemon, had a crush on Antigone, and the horror of what happened to her led him to suicide. And once he committed suicide, then Creon's wife also committed suicide out of grief for that, leaving Creon an empty, broken, lonely man. So this play explores conflicting duties that were developing between family members with their ancient traditions and norms, and then the duties that were developing between citizens and their rulers in these new organizations called poleis, where people tried to come together for mutual defense. That involved a whole new set of rules. And then finally there was the conflict between humans and gods. The gods had certain demands of people. Sometimes those conflicted with the demands of your father or your brother, or the local tyrant in this case. So we're going to hear two clips of Antigone speaking. This will not be my translation, just a good modern translation that I found. We'll talk about my translations later. These are just two quick speeches to give you an idea of who Antigone is as a person. First, we're going to listen to her response when King Creon brings her before him to be formally accused of this crime. So we'll see her defiance, and we'll see her explain why she did it. Then we'll also, of course, move on to her final words before she's locked in the cave. As you listen to these clips, bear in mind that I'm trying to simulate the experience of the listener being in an ancient Greek theater. I'm trying to change certain variables while keeping others the same. So we're translating the ancient Greek into modern English, but we're still hearing an alien culture. And the acting of the AI voiceover bots that I used is not great, but I think a modern theatrical audience would not be impressed or enthused with the quality of the acting that they saw in ancient theater. If this woman's voice doesn't sound authentic, then note that in the actual production, Antigone would have been played by a man. So I've already crossed oceans of awkwardness to reduce the unnaturalness of the dialogue. And I think the gulf that remains is educational, because the acting style would have been extremely formulaic by modern standards. It would be more like no theater or kabuki theater in traditional Japan. Let's go on and listen to what Antigone has to say, and this is what she tells her uncle Creon when she's arrested for performing the illegal burial of her brother.
Now, girl, were you aware of my decree?
How could I not have been? It was well known to all.
And yet you dared to disobey this law?
Yes, because Zeus did not make that decree. And Dika, goddess of justice, did not ordain such a law for mortals. I didn't think your decrees were strong enough to outweigh the firm and unwritten laws of the gods. They live not just today or yesterday, but for all time, and no one knows how long ago they were revealed. I was not about to pay the gods' price for fear of one man's arrogance. But if I die before my time, I count it as a gain. When someone endures all the evil that I have, how could they not live better in death? It won't be painful at all for me to meet this fate. But if I had allowed the son of my own mother to die and remain unburied, that would have tortured me. But this is nothing. Am I the fool, or is a fool accusing me of folly?
We can see here that Antigone is an interesting character. We often think of women in antiquity as not having any agency. And of course it's true, women had fewer legal and political rights than men. They had less social freedom than men. But the class distinction was, as I mentioned before, almost more important than the gender distinction. We have to remember here that Antigone is from the upper classes. She's a noble. And in antiquity, that meant a lot more than it does now. Antigone could be so defiant and have her opinions known because of her ancestry. She was one of the well-born, as they said. But Antigone shows us that even high-born nobles can't get away with betraying tyrants who've taken over the throne. So Antigone makes her point, but she meets her fate. She's sentenced to death. And the play isn't very explicit about the circumstances of her punishment, but it's made clear that she's going to be locked up, closed up, sealed up, or walled up in a cave and left there to die. So, terrible stuff. Now on stage, a crowd is gathering to see her sentence carried out, and let's hear her final, defiant, sad words.
Unwept, unloved, unwed. I am led in misery down this final path. No more can I, unhappy girl, behold the sacred eye of the flaming sun. No friend moans in grief. No tears are wept for my fate. O tomb, O bridal chamber, O deep dug everlasting home, the place I go to join my own. I will descend most shamefully before my time on earth can be properly spent. But when I go, I cherish the thought that I will go dear to my father, and dear to you, mother, and dear to you, my brother. Since when each of you died, I washed you with my own hands. I adorned you. I poured out funeral libations. And now, Polyneikes, this is my reward for burying you. O city of my father, O land of Thebes, O land of the ancient gods, I am led away now without delay. Princes of Thebes, behold the very last of the royal line. See what things I suffer, and at whose hands, all because I revered reverence.
Oh, wow. Okay, well, if I were a young, ambitious actor in Golden Age Athens, I'd be pretty excited about having those lines to deliver. That's an opportunity for Oscar-winning acting. So I guess we can think of Antigone as ancient Oscar bait, or maybe goat bait. We can imagine Greek actors in the Dark Age dreaming about being nominated for a goat someday. Then at the award ceremony, they hear their name called, go up to the stage, take the goat's leash from the presenter, and then make some long, boring speech thanking Zeus for their success. Now moving on from the heartbreaking drama to the dry mechanics of translation. What we just heard was not my translation, that was a mixture of other solid modern ones. But sometimes the translations aren't so great. The early modern translators showed a lot of reverence for the grammar and getting certain things accurate, but sometimes they would lose sight of the cultural elements in the script, and in particular, the musicality of the dialogue. So what we're going to listen to now is a short excerpt from one of King Creon's speeches. Now, after such a harsh decision, the people and Creon's advisors are not big fans of his. And in this next exchange, Creon is mauling about all the awful things he's done, and he rebukes the men who are questioning his authority. This is a stodgier, older, less lyrical version of Creon's speech, and this is what I would consider to be a translation that doesn't carry over the vibrance or the musicality of the original. Let's listen.
Old man, you all shoot your arrows at me, like archers at their mark, and I am not safe even from the plottings of the seer's divine art. But by their tribe, I have long been bought and sold, and made their merchandise. Turn your profits, make your deals for the white gold of Sardis and the gold of India, if it pleases you, but you shall not cover that man with a grave, not even if the eagles of Zeus wish to snatch and carry him to be devoured at the god's throne. No, not even then, for fear of that defilement will I permit his burial, since I know with certainty that no mortal has the power to defile the gods. But even the exceedingly clever falls with a shameful fall, when they couch shameful thoughts in fine phrasing for profit's sake.
Okay. Imagine being an advisor or a high noble in Thebes and having to hear that old guy drone on about duty and make accusations. He's clearly feeling the heat from the people around him. Now we're going to listen to the same passage, but using my translation. My goal with this translation was to put it in verse. The older translations often just translated the Greek into plain academic type prose. Now, this speech wasn't set to music, it wasn't a song. There was supposed to be a rhythm in the speech still. It was more like Shakespeare. It's really impossible to imitate some of the rhythms of ancient Greek in English while still maintaining some semblance of meaning. So I chose a good classic meter for English, iambic pentameter. I'm sure we've all heard that term before. A good example of a line of iambic pentameter is to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. You can hear the rhythm there. Also, at the end of my speech, I managed to find a way to use a semi-rhyme, as in matching ending vowel sounds. And that's something that Shakespeare did often as a verbal bow to wrap up the dialogue. I also tried to convey some of the extreme imagery that we see in the Greek. You know, we've got divine eagles scooping up dead bodies to lay them before the feet of Zeus. It's out there. So let's listen to my translation.
Gentlemen, you're all like patient archers with their arrows drawn. I'm just a useful target for your prophecies. But I was traded by your kind and shipped away in days long past. Go trade your goods for silvered gold from Sardis if you want, and gold from India. But that man you will never bury in a grave. And if, by Zeus's eagles, he is snatched away and carried up as food before the throne of God, I still would not allow this burial. I can't. A mortal can't commit this kind of blasphemy. The lives of very clever men will end in shame when shameful thoughts are dressed in careful words for gain.
Well, he certainly thinks he's right about everything. He is basically the only character that makes it out of the story alive. I suppose one lesson of ancient writing is that only the good die young. If you're some kind of old, awful, cruel, greedy person, then you get to live forever. So I've always tried to live by that principle. I tried to become as awful and cruel and greedy as possible so I could live a long time. And I'm doing fine so far. I think I'm onto something here. Okay, let's get back to our story and see what the younger, less awful version of me was doing after work each day. So we ended the day around 4 p.m., we'd pile back into the van. We'd try to stay awake on the drive home. When we got to the apartment, I would march up the stairs, go to my bed, dump all my equipment on the floor, and just collapse right on the bed. Dirt and all, boots and all. For the first few weeks, I was just too tired to do anything else after work. I'd just go unconscious and sleep until somebody woke me up for dinner at 7 o'clock. But after I got into better shape, lost some weight, got used to the routine, I'd start meeting Jenya at the one bar in town that we found at the train station. So from about 4:30 to 5:30, Jenya and I would have a few drinks. And we knew we'd be having as much wine as we could stand with dinner. And Italian beer was not amazing. So we ended up settling on what I guess you could describe as an Italian Tom Collins. It's basically San Pellegrino limonata with gin. So we just order in Italian as una limonata con gin. The bartender there was this guy named Enzo. He was Italian, but he had apparently spent a lot of time, I don't know, in Switzerland or somewhere, but he spoke some German and a little tiny bit of English. Jenya, of course, spoke Ukrainian and Russian, and then also German and English very well. Then here I am with English and a tiny bit of Italian and a tiny bit of German. Somehow we managed to get some kinds of conversations done. The cool part was this was before Italy switched to the euro, so they were still using lira. The lira was plummeting in value, so money wasn't much of a concern for us. We made sure not to change all our money at once, so we felt like we were getting richer and richer as the summer wore on. So after the bar, I'd come back and sleep from about 5:30 to 6:30, maybe a little closer to 7. Somebody would wake me up with enough time to get a shower, change clothes, because we always wanted to be presentable for dinner. Dinner was a big deal. The university hired a local lady to be our chef, and she made giant dinners 6 days a week. Dinner would last from 7 to about 11. It was a 4-hour deal. Maria would make frittatas, basically these sort of tough Italian omelets. Pasta fagioli, lots of beans in South Italy. There was some really good seafood stuff we had all the time. We had these a spicy mussels dish. Then we had, as I mentioned before, the fried fresh anchovies. In South Italy, there's a dish that's really popular that they just call frutti di mare, which is just the fruit of the ocean, the bounty of the sea. And it's shrimp and scallops, usually, in a clarified butter sauce with angel hair pasta. It's very good. Lots of bread. For dinner, we'd have a couple of big loaves of the bread from the bakery just that morning. And so we wouldn't cut into it till right when dinner was served, and that's when it's the best. There'd always be a chunk or two of sausage for your plate, and the Italian sausage there was extremely fatty, big chunks of white fat, and lots of fennel. And then a lot of table wine. Now, dinner wasn't just for me, Steve, Albert, and Daniel. The vegetarians would come over from their own apartment. We had a big table on a big balcony outside the apartment, and we were like on the 4th floor. So we got a good view of the town, but as I mentioned earlier, there's not much to see. It faced east, so you basically just saw some rundown buildings, and then the train station, and then wilderness. And that's only when the moon was out. On really dark nights, you didn't see much at all off the balcony. The vegetarians would usually show up late for dinner. They didn't do the survey work, so they weren't as physically tired, at least. So they would go to this abandoned building halfway between our apartment and the train station, and somehow they had found a supply of marijuana in Italy, and I have no idea how they found that connection, but the laws were pretty strict about that as far as I knew. Now, alcohol, all bets were off. I saw 15-year-olds chugging wine, no problem. Maria expanded her repertoire of dishes for the vegetarians. At first, she couldn't really understand it. She kept asking, "Non mangiano carne?" "You don't eat meat?" And we kept saying no. She'd sort of shrug her shoulders and go back to what she was doing. So we'd have the vegetarians, but then As the summer went on, we had other dignitary guests. We had a couple of art historians. This lady who was she was Portuguese and she was a ceramicist. She came by to study some of the artifacts from the Banca. Then we had some people from the Department of Antiquities. A lot of these Italian guests would be very quiet during most of dinner, but then start telling stories and jokes that everyone was laughing at, but they would tell the story in Italian, so I was barely keeping track of what they were saying. After dinner, Steve would hang out on the balcony, look at his notes, start planning the next day while he was drinking his Amaro Lucano, which is a kind of bitters that they drink in Basilicata in that region a lot. It tasted like Coca-Cola syrup, the stuff that you connect to your source of carbonated water to get a fountain drink, but when it's super concentrated, sort of like a black, super sweet liquid, well, that's what this stuff was. And supposedly it helped you digest your food properly and had all sorts of medicinal benefits, but I didn't like it. It was gross, so I'd be asleep by midnight. Our final passage from Sophocles is an important one. It's a big musical number that's performed by members of the chorus, not by Creon or Antigone. This was actually a song. It was set to music. The passage has come to be called the Ode to Man. There's no title for the passage in the actual script. It's just set aside as a musical number. But if you're going to come up with a title for it, using the word ode is not wrong. It's supposed to be a song. We've lost the melody to time. But the problem is that the word ode in English came to mean something usually positive. So when you say the ode to man, it sounds like Sophocles is about to praise mankind. And I think the Victorian era translators often missed this point, which is that Sophocles was a downer. He's not about to praise mankind. Now, this is a goat song, remember? It's a musical number, but it's in the middle of a tragic play. So we're going to listen to someone else's early Victorian-style translation of the Ode to Man. And the real problem is that the translator obviously didn't think of the material in its context. It's weird to praise mankind when we've been witnessing people who are supposed to be the best and the most noble humans doing the worst stuff right there on stage. I do want to note that I am being deliberately unfair in the audio I've created here because I've added a Victorian-era classical theater discussion cocktail party ambiance. And that sort of silliness is just to underline the major error, not only in tone, but in actual translation that I see in older published translations of this speech. The problem is with not translating a particular word correctly, and we'll talk about that after we listen. I'm not going to give you the full version of the Victorian speech because it's kind of insufferable. And I feel bad because I made it that way on purpose. So I feel guilty subjecting you to too much of it. But here goes. Welcome to the cocktail party. And let's imagine that one of your friends' annoying intellectual husbands stands up and wants to read a passage from Sophocles. Let's hear it.
Wonders are many, and none is more wonderful than man. This power spans the sea, even when it surges right before the gales of the south wind and makes a path under swells that threaten to engulf him. Earth, too, the eldest of the gods, the immortal, the unwearied, he wears away to his own ends, turning the soil with the offspring of horses, as the ploughs weave to and fro year after year.
Well, that sounded uplifting. But Antigone is a play about how people in power destroy their lives through their fanatical dedication to politics or ambition. It's about how a need for control leads to suffering. So the entire tone is completely wrong in that version. We need a tone that's thoughtful, grim, fatalistic, and accusatory toward human behavior. That cocktail party rendition there had a lofty tone that's pretty bizarre for a story that's supposed to remind the audience about how we're all corrupt and self-destructive. Also note that given the rhythms in that translation, even Andrew Lloyd Webber couldn't set that to music. And this is a number that was performed by the chorus immediately after Creon swears to punish the criminal who dared defy his edict to leave those dead bodies on the plains outside the city walls. And Creon wanted vultures and wild dogs to desecrate the corpses. Then right after that, we're going to start up a musical number praising humankind. Read the room, dude. Also, there's a primary difference between the content of my translation and the one we just heard, and it has to do with translating a Greek word, deinos. This is the word that the Victorians are translating as wondrous or amazing. And they're not wrong, it means that, but it means that in a negative way. So if something is deinos, it's marvelous and awe-inspiring, but in a way that causes fear or terror. So a double rainbow is not deinos, but a tornado is. Dolphins leaping out of the water, swimming ahead of a boat at lightning-fast speed is not deinos, but a 20-meter ocean wave in a storm in the middle of the Atlantic, that's deinos. Now, if you think I'm making too big of a deal of this, bear in mind that deinos is the Greek word that Victorian paleontologists used to create the word dinosaur. Those biology textbooks translate dinosaur as being Greek for terrible lizard. It could also mean terrifying serpent. So you can see that terrible is not a good translation either. It's more like the ancient idea of a monster as being a glimpse of the underworld or the divine. So the Victorian translation uses the word wondrous twice, which I think compounds the problem. The problem is there is no single English word that gets across that meaning of deinos. So I have to use wondrous or something to that effect, but I also have to figure out a way to bring in the idea of the fact that these are fearful things that we're finding so wondrous. So in this quote-unquote ode to man, Sophocles is pointing out that humans are awe-inspiring, but we inspire wonder in the same way that Godzilla or radiation is amazing. So the tone was completely wrong in the earlier translation. After all, this is supposed to be an art form derived from a religious ceremony where they killed a little goat at the end of it. Or at least that's what I would have you believe. Also, in terms of style, my translation, again, has a very strict meter, designed to correspond with the meter of the Greek. Now, the problem is, the lyrics in Greek are very clipped and brutish and short. They're clearly written for some sort of rhythm-forward music, almost like a slow march. So I went with iambic pentameter again, and I did set this to music, but you'll see the AI actor is not singing. I couldn't see a way of accomplishing that without some extreme cringe. So bear in mind, I envisioned this as something that would be performed along with cool costumes and pantomimes that reflected what was being sung about. So my goal here was to evoke the mood that I think would be present in the theater when this number was performed. And as you'll see, it's quite different from what most people might expect from reading those old, cheery translations. Let's take a listen.
Of all the many wonders of the world, the race of humankind I fear the most. This creature sails across the silver sea, though beaten back by surge and southern wind. Our lovely earth, the oldest of the gods, who never dies and carries every burden, this creature grinds her down from year to year. He breeds his horse to plow her winding rows. He sees a flock of birds with hearts that soar, then traps them in a snare. He also hunts the animals who wander in the wild. He weaves his nets with cunning hands to drag a brood of salty creatures from the deep. His able mind beguiles the herds that roam the hills and tames the bristled necks of horses on the plain.
Now that's a goat song. So notice how, once again, Greco-Roman culture has this way of making beauty out of something ugly. Sophocles is clearly looking at how aggressive and predatory and abusive and exploitative humans can be. And somehow he took this observation and he wrote a song about that ugliness that lasted forever. That's tragedy. Scholars have pointed out that Antigone contains every possible conflict. They're all built into the plot. We have the younger generations versus the older generations. We have internal family politics. We have tradition versus innovation. We have personal duties versus public order. In the modern world, we think that conflict occurs because something or someone is not doing what they're supposed to do. Something is out of whack. But ancient people, I think, saw conflict as permanently baked into the universe. It's a grim and brutal way of seeing the world, but it definitely helps you avoid disappointments. And I think that's something that our modern culture is lacking. We're always praising ourselves for being beautiful, and we dwell on our strengths. But antiquity calls us to take a look at our shortcomings. Modern people love things being orderly and nice. But in antiquity, people rarely got much of either one. I started to wonder whether my obsession with the past maybe had something to do with anxieties about the future. Maybe I was hoping that by looking into the past and seeing what people had gone through before me would help me figure out what the heck I was supposed to do. And in a way, the influence of these ancient authors did do that for me. They set out a path for me, but in another sense, they gave me a tragic view of the human condition. You could almost describe it as preparing myself for my life not having a happy ending. And thinking about the ancient Athenian concept of tragedy and how it puts your fate in your hands, that a life well lived can never be tragic. If my plane were to crash on the way back home to the U.S., it wouldn't be a tragedy. It would be just something terrible that befell someone, yet another human knocked down by circumstance randomly. And I think focusing on ancient writing puts you in a mindset that helps you deal more effectively with the awful things you might encounter in life. These were not soft people. We are. So I think we have a lot to learn from them. 2,500 years ago, you might have some dutiful sister defying a tyrant's decree, risking death just to bury her brother, some man who had fallen in battle. And so he's buried with love, and the people who took the time to bury him may have paid the ultimate price with their lives. And then, 2,500 years later, some American shows up and digs the guy up to get DNA samples from his teeth. In other words, Sophocles makes me feel like a grave robber. There was one afternoon early on when I got separated from the others. We were getting ready to survey some fields around a villa. And one of the farm workers on one of the gravel roads sees me walking through one of the fields, and he starts driving toward me. And when he gets close enough to me, he rolls down his window and he yells, "Que cosa cercando?" What are you looking for? And I gave him the normal spiel. I told him, "Io sono archeologo." I'm an archaeologist. So I took that question literally. What was I looking for out there? It was a case where I knew who I wanted to be and what I wanted to do, but never really figured out why. Why was that important to me? Maybe I was just closing in on a quarter-life crisis. Or maybe I was doing what I always do and overthink everything. Maybe I was just having a heat stroke. Okay, join me next time for part 3, where we will talk about comedy. Believe it or not, we need to lighten things up a bit. We're going to be talking about a comedy called Lysistrata by Aristophanes. Lots of jokes about sex and body parts and bodily functions. It'll be a blast. Unlike this episode, we'll talk about more extracurricular activities with my friend Jenya. And we'll talk about how I started to change and things I learned as the weeks turned into months. But I'll leave you with that final question. What are you looking for? Are you sifting through the junk of people that died a long time ago? Are you looking to dig up anyone's grave? Until next time.